Well, thank you very much for that nice introduction. We're very delighted to be here, and thank you for inviting us to speak. Over the last 7 years, as you've heard, I've been incredibly fortunate to have worked with many talented colleagues on a project called Making Art in Tudor Britain, and I've worked as the principal investigator. And I'm going to speak this evening with my colleague Charlotte Bolland, who's worked as the project curator. So we're going to do a kind of double act on this. Much of what we'll discuss today is the result of collaborative research with paintings conservators, with scientists, historians and other art historians. And the findings that we'll share with you could not really have been produced without the dedicated work of these colleagues. So it's been an extraordinarily exciting process of learning really from each other and a collaborative process across disciplines. And I hope that this collaborative model of working that we've managed, in doing so, that we've managed to achieve something bigger than the sum of its parts. And to say I'm extraordinarily grateful to start with to our many funders, particularly the Lithium Trust, the British Academy and the Esby Fairbank Foundation. I think it's been difficult for Charlotte and I to select material for this lecture because our research has spanned a 120-year period, not of research, I might say, but of history, as it were. Very detailed work into over 100 pictures. But I'm going to explore some of the project findings and talk a little bit about the context of the research. And then Charlotte's going to go on to talk about the work that we've done with research onto Tudor kings and queens for a special display which is on at the Portrait Gallery at the moment called called The Real Tudors, Kings and Queens Rediscovered. And I should say throughout this, there's an awful lot more on our website than we will look at and be able to touch on today. So I'm showing you some of those people who've been involved in the project and some of the key participants that took place, because this was a wonderful project to bring together people including your former President Maurice Howard as a co-investigator from the University of Sussex, and others both from the Courtauld and PhD students that we brought into the mix. So I think it's been very exciting to learn from colleagues, extraordinary experienced colleagues, but also younger researchers as well. We're seeing our conservation studio here and some of the work that went on. The idea behind this project was very much to explore critical questions around artistic practice, authenticity, patronage and display. And we undertook systematic analysis, technical analysis, on around about 120 paintings in the period 1500 to 1620, most of those from the Portrait Gallery collection, but we brought in quite a few comparative works to look at alongside our own collection. And in the course of the project, we generated a lot of data about dating, identity, functions, meanings of MPG pictures. But this was not a cataloguing project at all. We were looking to address some really quite critical questions about art historical practice. And even though I'm showing you many portraits here from the Portrait Gallery collection, this is all one genre. These are all portraits, one range of material. This data set really ranges from a very, very vast different sources, collected, of course, since 1856. And because they were not collected by artists, they're collected, of course, by sitter, this makes, for the 16th century, a much more representative range, both in terms of quality and in terms of the body of material that would have been produced in the 16th century. So some works, of course, we know very little about the authorship, and that doesn't worry us at the Portrait Gallery at all. We're interested primarily in the sitter, but it gives us an opportunity to look back into the 16th century. These don't come from one set of material, many, many different provenances, bought at auction at the art market, gifted through country houses, many, many different ways they've come, and I think that gives us a very broad data set, as it were, even though it's only all one genre. Well, the reason for taking this project on is that we had, of course, a lot of research on 16th century portraiture by Roy Strong in the 1960s, and his publication of the English Icon and Tudor and Jacobean portraits, both dating from 1969, having done wonderfully detailed work. But of course, that was over 40 years ago, and both technical analysis had changed and other sorts of work had begun to be developed, both with the Dynasties exhibition, which took place at Tate, and the exhibition display on Henry VIII at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. So we wanted to have an opportunity as the largest public collection of 16th century work to see what the Portrait Gallery could do by investigating its own collection and ask a range of different types of questions. The sort of research questions that we structured the project around were about artistic production, about influence and transmission between native painters and foreign artists coming to work in the UK, trying to understand the nature of Anglo-Netherlandish processes of transmission, identification of style and authorship practice, and then critically also markets and audience, thinking about commissioning practices and patronage and the re-examination of known and documentary sources. So this was a wide-ranging project, but principally involved a body of technical analysis. So there were 6 types of key technical analysis that took place, from chronology, looking of course at tree rings, infrared reflectography, looking through the surface of the paint layers to examine what were some of the first marks made by artists, to ultraviolet examination, picking up on recent marks made and restoration, and where necessary to undertake paint sampling to look at the structure of the panel and the paint layers. X-ray radiography, a critical technique, looking in a different way from infrared reflectography, but allowing us to look through the whole structure of the wooden panel. And then absolutely critical to this project was microscopy, and we acquired a new microscope to do this. But we learned so much about the handling of particular artists and the handling of paint really in the 16th century by really, really careful detailed analysis down the microscope. And much of the findings we'll talk about come through these different techniques, really importantly needing to be used together, because what you can learn from one, you can't learn from another. So I wanted to look at 3 different areas, and I'm going to talk about workshop practice, and I'm going to talk about authorship, and I'm going to talk about display, conservation, and functions of meanings before handing over to Charlotte. And I've got a few slides really to look at those 3 themes. And I'm showing you here these wonderful mini images of Catherine of Aragon, because one of the key features of Tudor portraiture is the multiple nature of versions of portraits, the same sitter, often in broadly the same pose. Now, why were these created, and what kind of functions do they serve? Well, the production of multiple portraits certainly met, I think, a quite lively demand for portraits that were parts of sets, but sets that were both large and small. We think about these for long galleries, but they also hung to us in a smaller format, in bars and possibly great halls, not necessarily only in the homes of nobility, but also of the gentry and the citizenry. And I think this idea reflects quite likely how infrequently sitters themselves sat, because these versions, there's a kind of Chinese whispers effect that you can see going on here, were copied again and again using the tracings for which circulated quite lightly between different studios. We've also done work on our many 7 or 8 versions of Holbein copies. The question was how closely were these related to the original Holbein images, and why were they produced? And of course they exist in many other collections than the National Portrait Gallery. And I'm showing you here Thomas More, Thomas Cromwell, Richard Southwell and Archbishop Wareham. And we found through the key medium of dendrochronology that all of these were really quite a lot later. They're created a good 50 years after Holbein's death. Now why might that be, and what does it tell us about collecting practices in the later 16th century? They're all Elizabethan or early Jacobean. Dendrochronology told us a lot about the last tree ring dating, indicating, for example, that Cromwell is early 17th century, Southwell must date from after 1588, and Archbishop Wareham from around 1605 to 21. And I think it indicates that many of these Holbein versions, not just in our collection, but possibly in others as well, show a real interest in the Elizabethan period for commissioning and collecting this material. Now, are they collecting Holbein, or are they collecting the sitter? And I think there's more work to be done by thinking about networks of patronage there. I'm showing you these two really interesting portraits of Thomas Gresham, one of which is in our collection and the other in the Mercers, because one of the things we did is often bring in or work closely with other collections that have other versions of portraits in the National Portrait Gallery collection. I think we learned something really extraordinary by looking at these two portraits of Thomas Gresham, of the same sitter, produced, we think, in the same studio around the same time. Gresham, of course, is clearly one of the most important merchants working in Elizabethan London, founder of the Royal Exchange, and a man, of course, with outstanding political and cultural networks. There's every reason why Gresham might want to well commission multiple portraits of himself to give to the many organisations he's connected with. What we learned in looking at this picture is that this painting has the same pentimenti. There are two areas of pentiment, a button which is repainted out on his doublet, and the hands which are changed. Now, why might this happen? Talking to the National Gallery, they've only seen this on one occasion with a Titian painting. What's going on when you've got two versions of the same picture in the same studio at the same time? And we think it's extraordinarily likely that Gresham is likely to have commissioned both portraits at the same time. That gives us pause for thought, because these findings raise questions about whether ideas about prime versions are always right. Is that a valid approach? Certainly that's something we know from the 18th century, but does that always happen in the 16th century? And I think it shows the ways patrons are engaging with portraiture as a means of promoting their own personal agency among different groups. And it may be a practice, of course, that happened more frequently. I'm just able to document it here. I hope you can see on these hands that the hands of the fingers at one stage were tighter and have become looser. And so is the patron going to is Gresham going back to say that he will have a less tight grip on his hand? I'm showing you here that the painting style is also slightly different in these two editions. And when we think about workshops, we shouldn't necessarily think that just because it's by the same workshop, it's necessarily absolutely by the same artist. And we know from the work that's been done with colleagues as part of this project, particularly at the Town, who's produced a dictionary of artists working in London very recently, that there are vast numbers of painters working in London attached to different studios. And of course, as part of the studio, there may be a number of artists working within it. I hope you can see the very slight difference in the handling of these areas. I want to move on to talk about authorship, and it certainly was not a key part of our project. The project had broader aims. We weren't looking to attribute pictures to particular names, and that has a major difficulty for the 16th century because there are so few Tudor artists, of course, that sign their work or necessarily perhaps have an extraordinarily distinctive style. But nonetheless, the project had to address the question of authorship, and particularly the gallery owns groups of pictures linked to the same artist. And I'm showing you here 3 pictures signed by the artist with a monogram by Hans Ewert, one of the few artists with an identifiable monogram. And comparing these incredibly closely, again using microscopy, it shows how analytical research of this kind can really help by understanding a particular technique. And you're looking here at Mary I, Mary Neville, Lady Dacre, Gregory Fines, Mother and Son, and Nicholas Heath on the far side, all with their lovely H.E. monograms. And I hope you can see the real, very close handling in the eyes. And here again are some of the wonderful technical images that we're able to take to just show how extraordinarily fluid and extraordinary at his best Ewert could be a really outstanding painter that could begin to use brushwork in a very, very blended and detailed way. And you can see these in all of these images. We also learned that there weren't necessarily absolutely agreed technical templates for the way that artists might be creating pictures, and these are infrared reflectography of many of these paintings. And we learned, of course, in a way, that what you can see here is that sometimes artists, it's perhaps not unexpected, change their approach with different commissions. There was no underdrawing for the faces under Dacre and Gregory Fine, but very, very detailed underdrawing for the Heath image. And I think that gives us, again, pause for thought by thinking about patterns and the way that patterns are used in painting, and that is not necessarily only about the creation of patterns that would then be made to reproduce paintings in multiple versions again and again. You might, in undertaking a commission, create a pattern that allows you to just get a very, very good transfer onto the panel itself, because I can't imagine that Heath necessarily wanted multiple versions. And then, of course, there are studio. This is very, very like Hans Ewert, but there are many things about this that didn't seem quite as accomplished as Hans Ewert, and it comes back to that whole attribution question about to what extent is, in terms of connoisseurship, does one need enough indications to be clear that Ewert is Ewert, or to what extent is an artist like Ewert extraordinarily talented and in demand, working in a much bigger way with other artists that are working directly with him. And we see that, of course, later on with artists like Van Dyck and Lely, who, of course, there's a much, much more documentation about studio assistants. And that's, I think, what we've got here with Anthony Brown, Viscount Montacute. We had a chance in the course of the project to look at other sign paintings, and we inquired this painting in the course of the project. And this is Oliver St. John, Baron St. John of Bletsoe. And it has this remarkable signature down the vertically down the right-hand side, as you can see here. Arnold Bronkhurst, Fake It, 1578. And it's one of the earliest signatures of an artist at this period. Why did, the question I suppose we've got not fully answered, but very much like thoughts on this, in this portrait, this one remarkable portrait of a not necessarily hugely important figure, did the artist feel able to make that signature happen? You don't see this really in the 1570s before. Was there a personal relationship? Why would the artist feel able to sign it? Is there a close relationship between the sitter and the artist? And I think those are sorts of questions that need further work. Bronkhurst is an artist that Roy Strong had been able to create a much bigger ode for, but in technical analysis, it was pretty clear that the work that had been attributed to Bronkhurst, and these are two from the Scottish National Portrait Gallery, clearly were not by the same artist. So the idea of A.B. having a bigger oeuvre, I think is under debate as a result of this research. I wanted to move on to Catherine of Aragon and the idea of display and conservation, because in terms of the functions and meanings of 16th century art, some of our research provided new information about how, where, and in what context paintings might have been displayed, appreciated, and what functions and meanings they would have served for their first audience. And we're very lucky to come across at Lambeth Palace this painting on the wall in a private dining room. I think my colleague and I, Sophie Plender, sort of pounced on this painting on the wall to think, well, it isn't possibly quite what Lambeth Palace necessarily think it is. It was identified as a portrait of Catherine Parr, but we were pretty clear it must be a lot earlier. And a number of a year or so of research ensued, and we were eventually able to have this painting on long-term loan for the Portrait Gallery. It's now on display. It's an extraordinarily interesting picture because it's a very early portrait of Catherine Aragon, and it is in its original frame. And I think you can see here from the back there are these lovely marks of hanging marks on the back, which would have been the original way that it could have been hung. And I'm showing you just on the far side there Mary Dacre, because in the background you have this lovely almost shoelace-like setup where it is pinned onto a wall, but that would probably, with these holes on the back, be how it would have been attached to the frame. And we can see that on the back of this portrait of Catherine of Aragon. We were able to undertake conservation work on the frame. It's very rare to have original frames. I think we've probably got about 160, 170 Tudor paintings in the National Portrait Gallery. We've got 4 original frames. So there are many wonderful frames here, and we were able to work closely with the Society of Antiquaries to begin to think, how do we restore the frame on Catherine Harrigan by looking at the remarkable examples that you can see right here. I almost don't need these slides on the wall because they're alongside, to have evidence of framing from this period because it's extraordinarily rare. We covered some early oil gilding revealed during exploration of the frame finishes and found fragments of vermilion paint on the decorative scheme. And so don't be shocked by this next slide because it's not quite as bright as this in terms of the restoration. It's rather pink, but do come and see this at some point at the portrait gallery because we were able to restore this frame back to what we believe is its original scheme. And it's interesting to think about the extraordinary kind of colourways and the extraordinary, almost kind of gaudy nature, perhaps, of 16th century portraiture at this moment in time. I wanted to move on to other sorts of objects because the nature of the collection as a portrait collection meant that we focused, of course, primarily on portrait heads, but other types of paintings were explored as well. And we were able to explore some wider questions about display. And this remarkable, truly remarkable, double-sided painting includes a portrait of Christopher Hatton, one of Elizabeth's favourites, surrounded by his horoscope with the text and emblems on the other side. I think this is an extraordinary survival of a Elizabethan interior, possibly for Hatton's home in London or his house at Holdenby in Northamptonshire. And technical analysis has shown this was an extraordinarily carefully planned out portrait. What we think, because it talks about this idea of meeting you in a vestibule, you meet me here in a vestibule, and I am designed to stir up lazy men. So there is something extraordinarily interesting about the agency of this portrait to ask questions of the viewer, whether it's part of a cupboard door or whether it's part of panelling that you move through in a vestibule. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to determine. But it does show you just how much has been lost in the 16th century. We're possibly looking at between survival rates of only 20–30%. Enormous amounts of painted interiors have been lost, and this is a real, I think, interesting find in this way. It belongs to Northampton Museum. At the moment is on loan to the National Portrait Gallery. But it gives you an insight into the types of way portraits perhaps might have been used in domestic interiors. And I wanted to touch on our remarkable portrait too of Henry Unton because the technical research that we did on this painting showed us something about where it might have been displayed and what type of function this extraordinary picture might have had. It's an unusual story picture depicting the life of the ambassador to France, Henry Unton. And we know it must be commissioned by his widow, Dorothy Wharton, who dies in about 1634. But it's a kind of almost comic book style of presentation, probably a type of presentation that was once much more common than actually survives today. Close examination shows that around, I can hopefully point this out to you, here around his neck there is a medallion, and the medallion was thought to be Elizabeth I, but looking closely at this under the microscope, we're pretty clear this is not Elizabeth I, but represents Henry IV of France. And of course that would make absolute sense, because what you go around the journey of Unton's life from his house in Oxfordshire, through the journey up through the Apple, his time at Oxford, and then his journey up through the Alps, and then his death in France. There he is as showing you his link to France rather than necessarily to Elizabeth. What was extraordinary about the technical analysis of this is it showed it was painted on walnut, and we haven't got any other pictures painted on walnut. Routinely, they are painted on Baltic oak or English oak. And interesting to know if that's rings any bells to anybody else here. Analysis has shown that the picture existed in an earlier incarnation before being enlarged, and possibly for a different setting. So if I show you this picture here, the red line is showing you what the picture would have looked like when it was first painted, and then it was enlarged just slightly later. I hope you can see the little red dots all the way around the edge here. These are where dowels would have been fitted, perhaps to fit it into a different type of framing environment. And the whole bottom here is an addition, but it's a pretty early addition, we think, that this is a 17th century edition. Now, this construction is extraordinarily unusual. It's likely, I think, to be intended to be hidden by a frame rebate. But the question is, did the painting serve perhaps as a monument in Farringdon Church before the stone monument was installed? We know the stone monument was installed in 1606, so the kind of 10-year window in this being created, commissioned by his widow in 1596, and then 10 years later the monument goes in. Does this sit in the church first of all, and then is expanded to come into the house and to be framed? But we do know that the picture was a portable painting by the time of Dorothy's death, as it's listed in her will as all my story pictures, unless the picture of Henry Upton, which is given to his niece. So this later image is the result of later intention. So I think we have a kind of clear sense of how a painting might have been used, been created and then adapted for a slightly later use. And then just to finish, before I pass on to Charlotte, some of our research on occasion has shown that there is new information provided about the ways that paintings have been appreciated by later audiences. And this is an extraordinary portrait of Mary Queen of Scots, once in the Royal Collection. It's listed, there is a Royal Collection stamp on the back. But it must have been hugely appreciated by later audiences in the 17th century, because of course it went through the Civil War and was dispersed. But what you can see from the X-ray is that the whole right-hand side is an addition. I think when you look at this closely, you can see this in the handling of the curtain and the hand. And what we know from dendrochronology is that while these two panels, the two main panels, which show the central panel and the other panel, are certainly mid-16th century, the later panel has a dendrochronology date after 1670. So something has happened to this portrait of Mary in the late 17th century. And it gives us a really interesting insight into the way some pictures were valued. In this case, it's a picture very likely to come from Scotland, be part of the Royal Collection, dispersed at the Civil War. And then at some point, it's collected and refurbished. Something happens to it, possibly in the Civil War, and you get a whole area which is repainted, and it's saved back as a Mary portrait. So that gives you some insight into the different ways that technical analysis can help us understand 16th century painting. I'm going to now pass over to Charlotte, who's going to look at those themes by looking at our display, The Real Tudors Rediscovered, and the key monarchs from the Tudor period.
Yes, so the ambition of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project was always to share the research results with a large audience. And so one of the major sort of final outputs is this display, The Real Tudors, Kings and Queens Rediscovered, which Tarnya and I have curated and is currently on at the gallery in rooms 1 to 3. And this exhibition focuses on the portraiture of the Tudor monarchs, because the gallery is in the relatively unusual position of owning numerous portraits of the same sitter. But it's wonderful to say this here within the context of the Society of Antiquaries, particularly when I can look to my left just here and see the wonderful pairing of having two images of Henry VII next to each other, and the kind of conversation you can have when you have images displayed in that way. And we also requested, and the gallery's portraits of Henry VIII, Elizabeth, had never all been displayed together at the same time before. And we also wanted to request to include a number of crucial and comparative works. And so this is where we are responsible for borrowing your wonderful portrait of Mary I by Hans Eweth, because in this, the hanging the exhibition has in itself furthered the research, because it's replicated one of the greatest research processes that we've had during the past 7 years, which is namely bringing works into the studio for comparative examination side by side. So many of the questions that we would like people to kind of consider in the exhibition, which have come out of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project, are captured in the astonishing effigy head of Henry VII from Westminster Abbey. And so firstly, there's the question of how does the image, the object now that we see, relate to its original appearance? So in this case, it's markedly different, because the figure, wig and clothes that would have covered the effigy are lost, leaving a much more austere image that was ever originally intended. And yet it's one that sort of fits with our idea of Henry VII. I think if Henry VIII's effigy survived in this form, we would find it much more challenging as our idea of what the characterization of the king within the kind of portraits that we have. Secondly, there's the question of how the portraits, the truth to an individual likeness through the use of patterns in portraits and the production of versions of portraits. And in this case, the pattern is what one might consider the most truthful pattern, a death mask. And yet the intervention of the artist is always there, because in this case, the Florentine sculptor Pietro Torrigiano has nonetheless brought the death mask to life to a limited extent in making the effigy. And finally, there's the question of materials, which this effigy also wonderfully demonstrates, because we have the variation between this modelled in plaster and the terracotta bust that's in the Victoria and Albert Museum and the gilt bronze tomb that's in Westminster Abbey. And so here you have three images, the same portrait of the same man, but refined through their use in different materials. And so it's these considerations of kind of likeness and materiality to then set up looking at the other two-dimensional painted portraits that we have within the exhibition. So bringing together kind of numerous images of Henry VIII does instantly make the point as to how much more widely his portrait circulated and the kind of numbers of portraits that were produced. And also the skill of artists in creating portraits of the king, but very much at a remove from the king's presence. So on the far left we have the gallery's portrait, and intriguingly within this, beneath it, the underdrawing reveals that the pattern that has been used has the features of a man with much thinner features. And there's such a question with the very early portraits of Henry / the portraits of Prince Arthur, trying to unpick which image is which. And so whether there's a kind of pattern that an artist has been forced to use, but then adapt to make something that is more representative of the king as he turns 30. At the other end, we've borrowed from the Royal Collection Hughes Van Cleve's portrait. Hughes Van Cleve was an artist working at the French court who may well never have seen Henry, and yet creates an incredibly engaging likeness through the use of miniatures, patterns, drawings, to create his own imagery. So the kind of great skill that artists have to work with what's available to create new images. And finally, to compare here, the two images that perhaps suggestive of the wider kind of production of portraits of Henry VIII. So we have our portrait, which is so similar to the galleries, to the Society of Antiquaries portrait just here, and the third version that survives in the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And the similarity between these objects, but that they are scaled to slightly different sizes, is very suggestive of images that were perhaps painted to order, or maybe even kind of off the shelf, as it were, within an artist's studio. And the kind of wider ownership of such portraits is suggested because whilst the provenance of 16th century portraits is often frustratingly kind of absent, the kind of giant gaps in it, we do believe that the gallery's portrait on the far right was owned by Anthony de Belassus, who was Henry VIII's private chaplain. So assessing the iconography of a sitter as a whole, being able to kind of gather together many images, also gives an intriguing insight into the afterlives of portraits. And particularly with this, the most kind of famous case is very much Holbein's image of Henry VIII. This is the image that established itself in our kind of imaginations as to what Henry looks like. And it appears that this happened kind of immediately, almost, from its production, because not only do we have the numerous full-length versions that are produced in the 1550s and then again by Hans Ueth, which were discussed and explored by the Walker Art Gallery in their exhibition. But then the kind of likeness goes on in a sort of truncated form to be produced in portrait sets, and to the extent that kind of extraordinarily it's able to be used as the frontispiece in this kind of woodcut form in an early 17th century play entitled When You See Me, You Know Me, and to have this image of Henry as the frontispiece. And yet, so with all the discussion as to the context of the Whitehall mural and the purpose of the Whitehall mural and how accessible it would have been kind of within the palace, nonetheless, the image of Henry clearly got out into the wider public imagination at a very early date. One of the other elements within gathering sisters together is you can see how compositions of a likeness can adapt, perhaps to suit the need of different patrons, slightly different circumstances. So this portrait of Edward VI we looked at in the first year of the project, and it was fascinating because the changes within it allowed us to date it to circa 1547, to the moment when Edward becomes king. And this is on the grounds of the fact that, as you can see in the X-ray detail, that the window on the right was originally planned to have a window on the left as well. And the column with the royal coat of arms that identify Edward as king was added at a very late stage in the process, not sort of years later, but very much as being completed. You also have the rather kind of touching illusion which shows how much thought has been put into Edward's kind of figure and stance. is that whilst obviously replicating Henry VIII's pose of the Whitehall cartoon and kind of very much an image of his father's son, that they had to move the position of his foot, that there's a limit to how wide you can make a 9-year-old stand. And so they just brought him in a little bit. Now, we have, within the project, as Tarnya was saying about this idea of authorship, because we've been assessing kind of general artistic practice within the 16th century, we've been trying to think about other ways of describing paintings, describing authorship. And we've come up with calling Edward associated with the workshop of what Master John, which is perhaps kind of an unusual attribution. The reasons for this is that the portrait of Catherine Parr, which has long been associated with Master John, that for Master John we have the first portrait, which is of Mary as a princess, which is related to a payment in 1544 to Master John, who drew her lady's grace in a table. This portrait of Mary and Catherine of Aragon are very sort of technically, they associate well together, and so we're very happy to attribute the Catherine Parr to Master John. And the portrait of Catherine Parr and Edward share a unique characteristic, something that we haven't seen in the analysis of any of the other paintings within the research project, and that is the use of a blue priming layer. So artists in the preparation of a panel could select whichever colours they might want to use, but it tends to be either a kind of flesh tones or perhaps a grey. This has a very deliberate use of large amounts of azurite in the priming, which gives the sitters this incredibly kind of luminous, cool tone. And so for that reason, we felt that we really had to associate these two works together because they had this very kind of unique characteristic, hence associated with the workshop of Master John. And the kind of wanting to keep the word workshop in the attribution, because it is also evident in Edward that not only is the kind of column by one hand, but quite possibly the carpet is by another specialist, and the figure, you get the feeling of many hands working within one painting. So for the exhibition, we wanted to have the opportunity to bring in kind of another comparative version into the space to be able to compare the works together, and borrowed this from Lord Egremont's collection at Petworth. That it was, we were able to secure some extra funding to do some analysis. We had been hoping to assess whether the same question was happening in this kind of circa 1547 question. On seeing the portrait, that we had believed it was on panel, so we had visions of dendrochronology, and walked in and saw, actually this is on canvas, this is a different question. But nonetheless, the handling seemed very happy for seemed very entirely appropriate for the mid-16th century. And on closer examination, it turned out that exactly the same situation has caused changes to these paintings as occurred with the galleries one. And that is, it has this incredibly specific change occurring in the Cartolino. So it now reads 1547 in his 10th year, but beneath the 7 you can see it's a 6, and beneath the 10 there's a 9. So it's a very specific change of a painting that's almost been completed in 1546, and then just sort of taken over the line with final finishing touches in 1547. Because of the changes that had happened to the addition of the royal coat of arms in our portrait, we were particularly interested in the column in Edward's portrait. And entirely fascinatingly, but infrared reflectography revealed that beneath the column, that actually there was a wreath there, but in this case it was overpainted because the Prince of Wales feathers had been painted on the column, and they needed to be kind of rubbed out. So I've included there the image of the stained glass to show you as a reference as the image that can be seen beneath the final paint layer in the column. So you have this same change in order to make a portrait of the Prince of Wales become a portrait of the King. And of course, the crucial moment in this is the fact that Edward has this fascinatingly rich iconography, because his sort of every update in his life is marked by the commissioning of a new portrait, which is circulated more widely. And the next stage in Edward's life was to be made Prince of Wales. But he was never actually made Prince of Wales because Henry died. So this production of portraits, you can see that they then had to suddenly update to become Edward as Prince of Wales to Edward as King. So art is responding to the sort of same problem within these images. And I'm just including the page reference there is in which Edward describes how he is preparing to be made Prince of Wales in his chronicle, and then is suddenly become king after hearing of the death of his father. So, as with the two Edwards, the one key comparison that we wanted to bring in for Mary, for our little portrait of Mary that Tarnya was talking about in relation to Ewart's work, was the Society of Antiquaries large-scale version of the portrait. And it provides such a key moment in discussing Mary's iconography, because particularly working through Mary's images, it's actually they convey the story of her life much more in a much more involved way than perhaps those of her father. And so it's really fascinating to be able to see how artists can work on different scales, and really serves the purpose of opening up people's eyes into the different ways that a pattern can be used. That Mary, the portrait is such key importance because it also offers the comparative to the Antonis Moore portrait that's in the Prado and the other versions and in private collection and in Boston. Because to have sort of signed portraits by artists of the same sitter produced in the same year raises all the questions as to what is a likeness, what is an accurate representation, because you consider the different characteristics that the artist has chosen to draw out. And whilst the image on the left, it appears is quite likely the type of portrait that Philip II would have seen before his marriage to Mary, the image on the right has been very much perceived as adhering to the impressions of Mary's kind of character and the damage that was done to her reputation in the kind of Elizabeth Protestant England that succeeded her. And yet it's important to note that Karel van Mander, when describing the fact that Moore painted this portrait of Mary, he actually recorded that she was an incredibly beautiful woman. So this image of Mary that's perhaps in our head as being the kind of slightly sort of cruel and incredibly austere image is actually was celebrated in its time as being a portrait of a beautiful woman. That with Elizabeth, I'm just going to talk briefly, the Phoenix and the Pelican portraits, two obvious kind of paired image, not in the sense that they would ever be kind of hung together, but in terms of production. And we were, during the course of the project, able to borrow from the Walker Art Gallery the Pelican portrait and to do comparative analysis. Wonderfully, they turned out to be on wood from the same trees, so evidently produced in the same place, and the patterns kind of match almost identically. But to talk about this idea of authorship, and again, how to identify, how to classify these portraits. And we have termed the Phoenix portrait associated with Nicholas Hilliard. Now this term is perhaps because you can see how closely it relates to the miniature that we have in the gallery's collection from 1572 of Elizabeth, that it really doesn't take much for the kind of face patterns to work together. And the Phoenix portrait has many sort of idiosyncratic qualities that do compare very favourably with the way in which the kind of a miniature is conceived, particularly in the incredibly linear depiction of Elizabeth's hair. This is, having the opportunity to do a project like this, you can suddenly kind of think of images of hair from across 100 images, and actually these are very kind of closely comparable. That during the course of the project, we were actually able to receive funding to conserve the Phoenix portrait. And so it has now been kind of revealed. It was hidden beneath, as I think you can see in this was its pre-conservation image, which was when we had it with the Walker Art Gallery. And then after Sophie Plender's wonderful work on the painting, it's now been transformed. And it's astonishing the kind of level of clarity within the painting is the thing that is always particularly impressive when you see it in the flesh, and also the sense of depth within it. And it sort of offers up an interesting question, really, that you can consider within the space. Is something like the Darnley portrait, an incredibly skillful portrait that we believe to have been by an artist who had access to the Queen to paint her from the life, and are believed to be very much an artist from the continent, very probably the Netherlands. And so this very kind of creamy handling of paint, and as to whether it can set up a sort of dialogue between the image on the right with much kind of crisper handling, that is this a moment where you can start to unpick something that is distinctively English in an approach to portraiture, an approach to line, when considering these two images together. And just to conclude that with the portrait of the Darnley, that we discovered this idea, the importance of considering how a portrait appeared in its own time, that whilst it's entirely impossible to recover now, no kind of restoration treatment would ever attempt to recreate a portrait, that from looking down the microscope, particularly at the Darnley portrait, found that the flesh tones had lost the final modelling of the red lake glazes through abrasion, through UV light. So this image, again, which adheres to this idea of Elizabeth, this very quite kind of chilly image of the Queen, actually slightly misrepresents its original appearance. She would have had a slightly more rosy, kind of healthy appearance. And so whilst definitely later in her reign, Elizabeth was kind of wearing extremely heavy makeup, that this perhaps would have been a slightly softer image in its original intention. And it's something that's rather wonderfully actually captured by Elizabeth in a letter that she wrote to her brother earlier as a princess, accompanying a portrait. She sent a portrait to Edward, saying that when you shall look on my picture, you shall vouchsafe it to think that you have but the outward shadow of the body before you, so my inward mind wisheth the body itself were oftener in your presence. And she notes that from the grace of the picture, the colours may fade by time. So it was entirely understood sort of at the time that the picture that you could have was a sort of transient image in a way, that time would affect it. And so finally, just before handing back to Tarnya, I wanted to say that we have the exhibition in London is the kind of fruition of the Making Art in Tudor Britain project. And it's actually going to travel to France for display at the Musée de Luxembourg next spring. It's very wonderful to see faces among the audience who are working on that exhibition with us, which has really raised interesting questions, because part of the reason we chose to focus on the monarchs in the exhibition at the Portrait Gallery is because within a situation of the biographical history of the nation, kind of the Tudor monarchs have a certain status and understanding, and actually to transpose that to a French context, to talk to an entirely different audience about the Tudors, is throwing up some really interesting questions about how they are kind of perceived as a dynasty, and how the role that France has had actually in particular in establishing the Tudors in actually the popular imagination through the 19th century. So that is a forthcoming thing next spring that I shall pass on to Tarnya.
Well, just to conclude, we've given you a very broad brush insight into the type of research we've done over the last 7 years. And I think one of the things that has become very clear to us in undertaking this project was the importance of a critical mass of data. It's been extraordinarily interesting to see patterns emerge as a result of the build-up of a body of data, be it about the way pigments are used, or the way that panels are put together, or where wood comes from, or indeed the way that artists are working across time. It helps us, I think, establish patterns of norms of production and meanings of particular anomalies. So although the MPGs looked at around 100 or 120 paintings in the period 1500 to 1620, I think the full significance of these findings to a degree is still in its infancy, and the widest interpretation of this material can perhaps only be achieved through further collaboration with other collections and the analysis of further works in other collections. And we're working closely with Yale Centre for British Art in New Haven to explore how the findings of our research can be taken forward with their collection, but potentially with further funding, we hope, with others as well. And then, just to finish, I wanted to show you some of the outputs of this project. Following a conference in 2010, we hope to publish next year, edited by myself and Liviva Bernstock, Maurice Howard and Edward Town, an essay volume called Painting in Britain, and we don't have a book that quite does that, 1500 to 1630, production, influences and patronage. So we've been hugely lucky to bring in the talents of many different individuals who are working in this field to see how we can take this work forward. Thank you.
Tarnya and Charlotte, thank you very much indeed. That was a masterly summary of 7 years' work, which has clearly been extremely exciting, and I'm sure, I haven't seen the exhibition yet, and I'm sure those of us who haven't been, our appetites are now truly whetted, and I'm delighted to hear that our own loans have played a useful part in your research, and that's very gratifying, because as a society, as you probably know, we do have a remarkable number of items in our collection which we are very keen to share, so it's very good to know it's contributing to research. I'm sure there are questions for you. As it's our usual practice, what I'd like to do is collect them up and then for you to answer them at the end. So may I take some questions? I think I've got a roving mic somewhere, so I'll kick off. I was actually interested to know, obviously you've learned a lot more about iconography and about the monarchs themselves. I was interested to know whether or not, in terms of the technical side of things, whether your exploration, in terms of your investigative conservation, had developed as a result of the work that you'd undertaken, whether or not that was an aspect of the work. Is you going to answer it, or do you do that? Hang on to it. Yes.
The word patronage is one thing. I wonder whether you came across, you would have looked at drawings perhaps also, and the drawings for the applied arts by these great artists. Did you find out more about them while you were doing this research?
Is that it? Anybody else like to? Yes.
I was very interested in the blue priming on the portrait of Catherine Parr by Master John, and I would like to ask how, as you write, relates to the blue background that we see on the top surface there.
I'd just like to ask, this morning I was looking at the two Marys. The smaller one looks like a much younger girl with a smile, and the larger one that's held by the society looks like an older woman, perhaps a little bit more serious. But they're both dated the same year. Is there a different purpose to the two pictures?
Well, just to kick off with the question about technical advances in the course of the project, it was something I think we were aware of at the outset, but of course it's extraordinarily difficult to know how technical advances will emerge. And indeed, I think there have been a dendrochronology project taking place in the 1970s when dendrochronology was far less advanced. So we're very aware about the uncertainty of investing public money and money that we've got from various different grant bodies in techniques that may be superseded, and it was something in the back of our mind in terms of contingency. I think broadly we were pretty lucky to have the technical team that we've had on board and had people working in universities and experts in different fields that could give us the right advice. There's no doubt that throughout the course of the project technical advances did emerge, and Charlotte, you should probably say something a little bit more about the work that went on in Italy and elsewhere.
Yes, the one sort of kind of big change that over 7 years, kind of particularly digital imagery has sort of really been transformed. And this has had one of the greatest kind of influence in infrared reflectography in relation to the kind of the early images that we could collect in the first years of the project with a Hanamatsu Vidicon, and you kind of scan the film feed and then edit together into a mosaic, so much smaller segments to make a mosaic. And now there are digital techniques in the Cyrus that kind of capture a whole digital image from the infrared. And we actually were able to receive funding from Charisma for MoLab to come, which with scanning infrared equipment, which can go into much further reaches of the infrared spectrum. And so that actually gave an opportunity to see kind of much further within the paint layers. And so it was absolutely true that technological advances, particularly with a portrait of Walter Raleigh, that where a change had been made so that his hand, which is now on a table, was originally on his hip. This was extremely clear using the scanning infrared. Once you then knew it was there, re-examining the images, the earlier images, you could see that there were perhaps traces, but that were much less kind of comprehensible within the project.
We hadn't picked that up
yes,
with the
exactly,
earlier techniques. So we were also supported by an extremely I think, knowledgeable advisory team, particularly from the National Gallery and their technical and scientific staff. So it was important to maybe keyed into a network of people who were talking about some of the same things at the same time, and that helped us hugely, I think. And to pick up on the question about drawing, which is a really interesting one, and in a way a very frustrating one, because I feel constantly cross with 16th century artists that they didn't keep their drawings as routinely as they should have done. There are so few drawings of portraits that help you understand something about how sittings might have been made and how the transfer process between doing a drawing of something like this and then capturing the likeness onto a painting. We have 4 or 5 drawings in the portrait gallery collection which we think are patterns, potential patterns that we've circulated between our artists' workshops, but they're phenomenally rare. And if you go and ask in the British Museum for their 16th century anonymous British material, you'll find an incredibly thin, very, very folder that takes people ages to find, because these simply, so few drawings exactly exist. There are, of course, drawings for the applied arts, there are architectural drawings, and there are drawings for decorative fountains and all sorts of other things. We didn't, as part of this project, routinely look at drawings because we didn't work closely on the decorative arts material, except where they had a relationship with particular objects within paintings themselves. It was again another project, and it's something I think in extending this project and working with other collections is something we'd very much like to do, and what it tells us. We had a quick look at some, well, 6 months I said, in the course of the 6-year project, look at our miniatures, and we do have something online about the research we've done on that. Charlotte, you should say something too.
Well, yes, a little bit about the kind of the wider scope of the project, sort of beyond portraits, and so particularly to flag Edward Town's work, because in researching the biographies of numerous artists working in London, he has also been looking into the kind of more ephemeral sketches and things that do survive. So I would say very much to look at Ed, and then in case I forget anybody in the volume, but we do also have, if I can sort of scan, but Elizabeth Goldring's been working on heraldic painters, and so the scope of the essay volume does kind of broaden, place the portraits within the context of broader discussion as well.
And then I think there was a question about blue priming and the question of azurite. Charlotte, you want to touch on that?
Yes, it's one of the kind of, with examining the paintings down the microscope, and very much as coming to this project as a historian, art historian, and so completely guided by the expertise of Sophie Plender, Sally Marriott and Polly Saltmarsh. But it's astonishing how much the kind of clarity you can see in looking down a microscope. And one of the greatest tools we had was what Tarnya showed at the beginning of the show, was linked up to a video feed. So it's always kind of very difficult to try and show things if you're looking down a microscope one at a time. So we could actually kind of have a conversation in dialogue. And capturing certain kind of beautiful images that are kind of beautiful in and of themselves. And actually the Catherine Parr azurite in the background is one of those. It's one of my kind of favourite ones, in that you can see that it's incredibly deliberately used as azurite within the priming, but the density of the pigment in the background is glorious. And it's one of those things as to also how a kind of project evolves over the course of the years of doing the analysis. And so at the beginning, I think it would be sort of fair to say that in breaking new ground, so noting things and kind of going, oh gosh, is this unusual? But then kind of 2.5 years in, to retrospectively look back and go, no, that's consistent with actually across the board, whereas this is familiar. So how important it is to have that kind of critical mass of information.
Because I think when we found it, we didn't know that blue ground wasn't more common than it actually was. I don't know, we could perhaps get Sophie Plender to say something a little bit more about that if you're interested. She's worked very, very closely with grounds. We haven't found that blue ground anywhere else. So it is very, it's very tense and it's very obviously applied. But it also has an amazing luminosity. It creates those 3 pictures which allow, there must be some reading for the artist in how you build up layers, because it definitely has an aesthetic effect of creating a beautiful luminosity to the flesh. There was another question about Mary I and the difference between the 2 sizes of the facial. And I'm always intrigued by artists who can work on very, very different scales. And it's often, I think, interesting to compare artists who can work and create what's called paintings in large to miniature paintings. Holbein could do it, Ewith could do it, some really talented artists, but you do often get real changes in technique and in handling. If you looked at the images I showed for Ewith, sometimes the techniques that are used there and the sort of tools that are used there, we think that there are, in some cases, there are kind of combing tools almost, which are manipulating the paint in particular ways to create different sorts of effects, does actually give different sorts of impressions. We think we're absolutely right in saying they're created in the same year, with no reason to doubt the dates. Do they have different purpose? Absolutely. There are 4 known examples that survive of the Ewith of Mary. There must have been others too, and are they given or are they gifted? And some of those are also paired, not necessarily by Ewith, but the image is copied, paired with Philip. So to what is the extent that those objects are used and given as diplomatic gifts or other sorts of things? And it makes them in a way more charming objects, that you've got this slight variation in likeness, but it is definitely, there's no reason to think it isn't the same artist and it isn't the same date.
One thing in kind of becoming aware of exactly that sort of point is that you can only sort of do it when you bring things together. You suddenly sort of realise how subtle a characterisation is. It particularly also happens with Edward a lot, that I don't know whether it's because as a sort of young boy, but how small a difference can make where suddenly he seems older or not within paintings that occur within the same year. but particularly with the Mary, as you say, that she does look softer, sort of slightly more kind of attractive within that smaller image. And so it does raise the question as to, because of the later imagery of the kind of slightly cruel quote that emerges during Elizabeth's reign of how Philip II cursed the painters when he met Mary. And so is this the type of slightly more sort of sympathetic, soft image that went to Philip first? Kind of its portability, not necessarily not sort of that exact one, but the kind of smaller versions of Mary that could well have been kind of making their way to Philip before.
And it's a very interesting question, because it does relate to one of the things that Charlotte and I almost feel that we missed as curators in putting these, to put the wonderful portrait, which you can see here, of Mary by Hans Ewer alongside the painting by Antonius More, because you do have very, very different expressions in both of those. One commissioned very likely by Philip and is almost showing Mary as a Habsburg consort, and the other commissioned prior to her marriage, which is showing her as a more sympathetic figure. And there's something extraordinarily interesting, I think, about the same sitter, painted by different artists in different circumstances. And at some stage it would be lovely, I think, to show those two pictures alongside the Prado image and the Sargent image. I hope we've answered the questions that were there. Thank you for those.
Thank you. I think you'll all agree that we've been extremely fortunate to have Tarnya and Charlotte here this evening. It's been a really stimulating talk. Thank you very much indeed. And shows just what can be achieved, I think, when you have a great set of research objectives, an excellent team, and funding and partners to actually make it happen. So it really is a model in terms of investigative conservation, research, and all sorts of different kinds of dissemination, because I was struck at the beginning by the fact you said that that was very much an ambition to make sure that it reached your work, which is as wide an audience as possible. And I think that's really admirable. And of course, here at the Society, our aims chime very much with the aims of your project. We are about investigative research, conservation, and making those results of our work and what we do and stand for here available to a wider public. So it's very interesting to hear what you have to say. And in a more modest way, we have been researching our own pictures. As you've already said, we have a remarkable collection, only some of which are in this room. And our own picture catalogue is now with the publishers, and I think is due for publication imminently, which is very exciting after a considerable amount of research, and I think will increase knowledge of our pictures and also make them more readily accessible. So I hope that in our own way we will be adding to that critical mass which you referred to earlier.